In a modest suburban home on the outskirts of town, David Chen had always considered himself fortunate to have his 78-year-old grandmother, Mrs. Liu, living with him. After his mother's passing 3 years ago, he had promised to look after her, and she had become not just family but his closest friend. Her presence filled the house with warmth, from the aroma of her traditional cooking to her gentle humming while tending to her small garden. However, the peaceful rhythm of their life together began to shift when Mrs. Liu started experiencing mysterious falls. The first incident occurred on a quiet Sunday afternoon while David was at work. He returned home to find her sitting in her favorite armchair, a small bruise forming on her forearm. She brushed it off as simple clumsiness, but something in her eyes told a different story. As the weeks passed, the falls became more frequent. Each time David questioned her, she would offer a vague explanation with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Just these old legs of mine," she would say, but her usual cheerful demeanor had begun to fade. David noticed she was becoming increasingly withdrawn, spending more time in her room and less in her beloved garden. The situation reached a breaking point when he discovered her one morning, sitting on the kitchen floor, her hands trembling as she tried to pull herself up. This time, there were tears in her eyes, something he had never seen before. When he helped her up, she clutched his arm tighter than usual, but still refused to explain what had happened. Working as an IT specialist, David spent his days solving problems through technology. As he lay awake that night, listening for any sounds of distress from his grandmother's room, an idea began to form. If she wouldn't, or couldn't, tell him what was happening, perhaps there was another way to find out. The decision wasn't easy. The thought of installing a hidden camera felt like a violation of trust, but his concern for her safety outweighed his misgivings. The following weekend, while Mrs. Liu was at her weekly senior center meeting, David carefully installed a small, motion-activated camera in the corner of the living room, where most of the falls had occurred. He positioned it discreetly behind a family photo, making sure it had a clear view of the entire room while remaining invisible to the casual observer. The first few days of footage showed nothing unusual, just the normal routine of his grandmother going about her day. She would sit in her chair, reading her Chinese newspapers, occasionally getting up to water her plants or prepare a cup of tea. But on the fourth day, something changed. David was reviewing the footage during his lunch break at work when his hands began to shake. The timestamp showed 10:23 a.m., and what he saw made his blood run cold. His grandmother wasn't alone in the house as she should have been. There was someone else there, someone who wasn't supposed to be, and suddenly the mysterious falls began to make terrible sense. The image quality was crystal clear, showing a figure entering the living room through the kitchen door, someone Mrs. Liu clearly recognized, given her lack of alarm. But what happened next would change everything David thought he knew about their peaceful suburban life. His finger hovered over the pause button as he struggled to process what he was witnessing, knowing that this discovery would set in motion a chain of events that would affect not just his family, but the entire community. As the scene continued to unfold on his computer screen, David realized that the real mystery wasn't about the falls at all. It was about why his grandmother had chosen to keep silent about what was really happening in their home. The truth would prove to be far more complex and heartbreaking than he could have imagined, leading him down a path that would test not only his relationship with his grandmother but also his understanding of family, trust, and the lengths people go to protect those they love. David's hands trembled as he rewound the footage, desperate to confirm what he had just witnessed. There, clear as day, was their next-door neighbor, Mrs. Anderson, a retired nurse who had lived on their street for over 2 decades. She had always seemed so kind, often bringing over homemade cookies and checking in on Mrs. Liu when David was at work. But the camera revealed a different side to their supposedly caring neighbor. The footage showed Mrs. Anderson entering through the kitchen door using a key, one that David had given her for emergencies. She moved through the house with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. What shocked David most wasn't just her unauthorized entry, but what happened next. She began searching through drawers and cabinets, methodically going through his grandmother's belongings while Mrs. Lu was napping upstairs. When Mrs. Lu unexpectedly came downstairs and caught Mrs. Anderson in the act, the neighbor quickly straightened up and put on a friendly smile. But there was something unsettling about how she approached his grandmother, speaking in an overly sweet voice while subtly backing her toward the stairs. The camera's microphone picked up fragments of conversation. "Your memory isn't what it used to be, and you must have forgotten inviting me in." David watched in horror as his grandmother became visibly confused and distressed. When Mrs. Lu tried to move toward the phone, Mrs. Anderson blocked her path, causing her to stumble backward. This explained one of the recent falls, but David suspected there were more incidents that hadn't been captured on camera. The footage continued to show Mrs. Anderson helping Mrs. Lu back to her chair, all while maintaining a facade of concern. She even made tea afterward, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. But David could see his grandmother's hands shaking as she held the teacup. Her eyes downcast, her usual vibrant spirit diminished. As he continued watching through days of footage, a pattern emerged. Mrs. Anderson would visit when she thought David was at work, always with the same routine, searching, intimidating, and then playing the role of the concerned neighbor. But what was she looking for? And why had his grandmother kept quiet about these intrusions? The answer came in an unexpected moment captured on camera. During one of Mrs. Anderson's visits, Mrs. Lu had quietly mentioned something about old letters and your mother's mistakes. The neighbor's reaction was immediate and aggressive, though carefully controlled. This wasn't just about robbery, there was history here, dark secrets that had been buried for decades. David spent his entire lunch break piecing together the fragments of conversation caught on camera. His grandmother had apparently known Mrs. Anderson's mother years ago, back in their old neighborhood. There were letters, important documents of some kind, that Mrs. Lu had kept safe all these years. Whatever was in those letters, Mrs. Anderson was desperate to find them. That evening, David drove home with his mind racing. He had always thought of their neighborhood as a safe haven, where everyone looked out for each other. Now he realized that behind the manicured lawns and friendly waves, there could be hidden motives and long-buried secrets. The weight of protecting his grandmother felt heavier than ever. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed Mrs. Anderson in her garden, pruning her roses. She waved at him with her usual friendly smile, and David forced himself to wave back, his skin crawling at the thought of her true nature. Inside, he found his grandmother in her usual spot, knitting quietly. When she looked up at him, he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, fear, perhaps, or maybe relief at having him home. David sat down across from her, his heart pounding. He needed to confront this situation, but he had to be careful. His grandmother was proud and private, she had kept this secret for a reason. As he opened his mouth to speak, she surprised him by placing her knitting needles down and saying softly, "You know, don't you? You've seen what's been happening." The look they shared in that moment was one of understanding and unspoken pain. But before Mrs. Lu could say more, the doorbell rang. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Anderson standing on their porch, holding one of her signature plates of cookies. David and his grandmother exchanged glances, knowing that the moment of truth had arrived. Whatever secrets lay buried in their past were about to come to light, and nothing in their quiet suburban life would ever be the same again. David's hand hesitated on the doorknob as Mrs. Anderson's shadow loomed through the frosted glass. His grandmother had already risen from her chair, her face set in a determined expression he hadn't seen in years. Before he could open the door, she touched his arm gently and whispered, "Let me handle this. It's time." When they opened the door, Mrs. Anderson's smile faltered slightly at seeing David home early. "Oh, I thought you'd be at work," she said, trying to maintain her cheerful demeanor. "I just brought over some fresh-baked cookies for your grandmother. We've developed such a nice routine of afternoon tea together, haven't we?" Mrs. Lu stepped forward, her small frame somehow filling the doorway. "No more pretending," she said firmly, her accent thick with emotion. You want the letters? Let's talk about the letters. Mrs. Anderson's face drained of color, the plate of cookies trembling slightly in her hands. David ushered them both into the living room, hyper-aware that they were standing in the exact spot where he'd witnessed so many disturbing scenes through his hidden camera. Mrs. Anderson sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, the cookies now forgotten on the coffee table. His grandmother disappeared upstairs for a moment, returning with a small, ornate wooden box that David had never seen before. These letters, Mrs. Liu began, her voice steady despite her trembling hands, they tell the truth about what happened in 1975. Your mother, she made me promise to keep them safe, to protect her story. But now you come here, threatening me, searching my home like a thief. You want to destroy her truth. Mrs. Anderson's composed facade crumbled. Those letters are full of lies, she hissed, her friendly neighbor persona completely gone. My mother would never have, she couldn't have. Her voice broke as Mrs. Liu carefully opened the box. Inside were dozens of yellowed envelopes, their edges worn soft with age. David watched as his grandmother selected one and began to read, My dearest friend, by the time you read this, I will have left town. I cannot bear the shame of what Richard has done, using his position at the bank to steal from so many families in our community. The money he embezzled, it was millions. He claims it was for us, for our future, but I know the truth. He gambled it away, every penny. Mrs. Anderson stood up abruptly, her hands clenched into fists. Stop. My father was a respected man. He died with his reputation intact. Mother always said he was falsely accused, that he was protecting someone else. She trailed off, uncertainty creeping into her voice. Your mother wrote these letters to me over the course of a year, Mrs. Liu continued gently. She discovered what your father was doing, how he was stealing from immigrant families who couldn't speak English well enough to question their accounts. She was going to turn him in, but then. Then what? David asked, breaking his silence for the first time since they'd sat down. The tension in the room was palpable as both older women turned to look at him. Mrs. Liu's eyes filled with tears. Then she discovered she was pregnant with you, she said, looking at Mrs. Anderson. Your father threatened to blame everything on her if she spoke up. Said no one would believe an immigrant bank teller over him anyway. He had friends in high places, you see. Your mother chose to protect you, to keep her silence. But she couldn't live with the guilt. These letters were her confession, her attempt to make things right somehow. Mrs. Anderson sank back onto the sofa, her face ashen. All these years, Mother told me father was a hero. That he died trying to expose corruption at the bank. She said. Her voice cracked. She said it was the immigrants who tried to frame him, who drove him to his death. Your father took his own life when the investigation got too close, Mrs. Liu said softly. Your mother couldn't bear to tell you the truth. She made me promise to keep these letters safe, to protect you from the truth until you were old enough to understand. But she died before she could tell you herself. David watched as the realization of decades of lies washed over Mrs. Anderson's face. The woman who had terrorized his grandmother suddenly looked small and lost, like a child whose world had just shattered. He thought about all the families who had lost their savings, about Mrs. Anderson's mother carrying the weight of her husband's crimes for all those years, about his own grandmother keeping this painful secret safe for decades. The Falls, he said suddenly, looking at Mrs. Anderson. You were searching for these letters all this time? You hurt my grandmother because of the past? Mrs. Anderson covered her face with her hands. I heard rumors, whispers about what really happened. I couldn't bear the thought that everything I believed about my father was a lie. I convinced myself that if I could find these letters, destroy them, the truth would stay buried where it belonged. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Outside, the suburban afternoon continued peacefully, oblivious to the decades of secrets unraveling within these walls. Mrs. Lu reached across and placed her wrinkled hand over Mrs. Anderson's trembling ones. "Your mother was my dearest friend," she said softly. "She wanted you to know the truth someday, but she wanted you to be strong enough to handle it first. Perhaps now is that time." The weight of truth hung heavy in the room as David brought them all cups of tea, a simple gesture that felt necessary in the face of such overwhelming revelations. Mrs. Anderson's hands shook as she lifted her cup, her eyes fixed on the wooden box that contained the letters that had shattered her world. "There's something else you should know," Mrs. Lu said quietly, pulling another envelope from the bottom of the box. This one was newer than the others, the paper still crisp. "Your mother wrote this letter to you just before she passed away last year. She asked me to keep it with the others, to give it to you when you were ready to hear the truth." Mrs. Anderson stared at the envelope as if it might burn her. Her name was written on the front in her mother's familiar handwriting. David watched as she traced the letters with her fingertip, tears falling silently down her cheeks. "I was so angry," she whispered, not looking up. "When Mother died, I found hints in her diary about these letters, about some terrible secret she'd been keeping. I convinced myself that Mrs. Lu must have been blackmailing her all these years. I thought I was protecting my mother's memory." She looked up at Mrs. Lu, her face filled with shame. "Instead, I became exactly what I feared, someone who would hurt others to hide the truth." David felt a complex mix of emotions as he watched the scene unfold. His anger at Mrs. Anderson's treatment of his grandmother was still there, but it was tempered now by understanding. He thought about his own mother, about the lengths he would go to protect her memory. Mrs. Lu reached into the box one final time and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. "Your mother kept track of every family your father stole from," she explained gently. "She spent years secretly repaying them from her own savings. That's why she never moved from that small apartment, why she worked 2 jobs until the day she died." Mrs. Anderson opened the notebook with trembling hands. Page after page was filled with names, amounts, and dates. Next to each entry was a check mark, and many had small notes: children in college now, opened their own business, retired comfortably. "She repaid everything?" Mrs. Anderson asked in disbelief. "Every penny," Mrs. Lu confirmed. "It took her 30 years, but she did it. She wanted you to know that part 2, that it's never too late to make things right." David watched as Mrs. Anderson finally opened her mother's last letter. As she read, her shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. Mrs. Lu moved to sit beside her, placing a comforting hand on her back, the same woman who had been terrorized by her just days ago now offering comfort in her moment of grief. "My dearest daughter," Mrs. Anderson read aloud, her voice breaking, "by the time you read this, you will know the truth about your father. But please know this too, your father's sins are not your own. I kept this secret not just to protect you from shame, but to give you the chance to become your own person, free from the weight of his choices. You have grown into a strong, successful woman, and that is your truth." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "I've spent my life trying to repair the damage your father caused. Each family he stole from has been repaid, but I know money alone cannot heal all wounds. My deepest regret is not telling you the truth sooner. I was a coward, afraid of losing your love. Mrs. Lu has been my dearest friend through all of this, keeping my secret, supporting me as I work to make amends. Please don't let bitterness poison your heart as it did your father's. With all my love, Mother." The room fell silent as Mrs. Anderson folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. She turned to Mrs. Lu, her face etched with remorse. "I was so wrong about everything. The way I treated you. I can never make up for that." Mrs. Lu patted her hand gently. "Your mother forgave your father's sins. I can forgive yours. But now you have a choice to make, just as your mother did. Will you let this truth destroy you, or will you let it heal you? David stood up, moving to the window. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across their peaceful suburban street, where neighbors lived side by side, each house holding its own collection of secrets and stories. He thought about the hidden camera that had started all of this, still recording silently in the corner of the room. Sometimes the truth could only come to light through difficult means. We need to talk about what happens next, he said, turning back to the two women. These falls, the harassment, it can't just be forgotten. His protective instinct toward his grandmother was still strong, even as he felt sympathy for Mrs. Anderson's situation. Mrs. Anderson nodded, wiping her eyes. I understand. I'll accept whatever consequences you think are appropriate. But first. She looked at Mrs. Liu imploringly, would you tell me more about my mother? The real story of your friendship? I feel like I never really knew her at all. As evening settled over the neighborhood, Mrs. Liu began sharing stories about her friendship with Mrs. Anderson's mother, tales of two young women navigating life in a new country, supporting each other through hardships and celebrations alike. With each story, David watched Mrs. Anderson's face transform, grief and regret giving way to something like wonder as she discovered a mother she had never truly known. She used to bring me dumplings every Chinese New Year, Mrs. Liu recalled, smiling at the memory. She never quite got the folding right, but she tried so hard to learn. She said our friendship was worth more than any money in the bank. The irony of those words hung heavy in the air. David had stepped into the kitchen to prepare dinner, giving the women space to talk, but he could still hear their conversation. His grandmother's voice grew stronger as she shared these long-held memories, as if unburdening herself of these secrets was physically lifting a weight from her shoulders. The day she discovered what your father was doing, Mrs. Liu continued, her voice softening, she came to my house in tears. She had found discrepancies in the accounts, patterns that couldn't be explained. When she confronted him, he threatened to blame everything on her. She was pregnant with you, barely showing. He knew she wouldn't risk losing everything. Mrs. Anderson wiped fresh tears from her eyes. All those extra jobs she worked. I used to feel so ashamed that we lived in such a small apartment when my friends had big houses. I even blamed her for not investing the life insurance money after Dad died. But she was paying back his debts all along. David returned with a simple dinner of soup and sandwiches, setting them on the coffee table. As they ate, he noticed how Mrs. Anderson's hands had stopped shaking, how she sat straighter, as if accepting the truth had begun to free her from an invisible burden. I need to make this right, she said suddenly, putting down her bowl. Not just with you, Mrs. Liu, but with the community. Those families my father stole from, some of their children still live in this neighborhood. I've been serving on the city council, chairing the community development committee. She paused, an idea forming. Maybe it's time to create a community support fund, something to help immigrant families start businesses or send their kids to college. Mrs. Liu reached for her hand. Your mother would be proud of that idea. She always said the best way to heal old wounds is to prevent new ones from forming. David had been quietly processing everything while checking the camera footage on his laptop. He turned to Mrs. Anderson. I have video evidence of the falls, the harassment, he said carefully. Legally, we could press charges. Mrs. Anderson straightened her shoulders. I understand. I'll resign from the city council immediately, of course. And I'll make a full confession to the police if that's what you want. It's what I deserve. But Mrs. Liu shook her head. More secrets, more shame, haven't we had enough of that? Perhaps there's a better way to make amends. She looked at her grandson. David, what do you think? You installed the camera to protect me. You should have a say in what happens next. David closed his laptop, considering carefully. The anger he had felt watching his grandmother being terrorized still burned, but he thought about cycles of pain, about how secrets and shame had poisoned 3 generations of lives already. "I think," he said slowly, "that we should focus on making things right, not just punishing past wrongs. But Mrs. Anderson, you need to understand, this isn't just about making a donation or starting a fund. What you did to my grandmother, that was elder abuse. It was criminal." Mrs. Anderson nodded, her face solemn. "I know. I let my fear and anger blind me to what I was becoming. I'll do whatever it takes to make amends, therapy, community service, whatever you think is appropriate. And Mrs. Liu," she turned to the older woman, "I know I have no right to ask this, but would you be willing to share more stories about my mother? I feel like I'm finally getting to know who she really was." Outside, the streetlights were coming on, casting a warm glow through the windows. A neighbor walked by with their dog, waving cheerfully, unaware of the decades of history being untangled inside. David watched his grandmother's face as she considered Mrs. Anderson's request, saw the years of kept secrets and suppressed pain beginning to fade. "Your mother was my dearest friend," Mrs. Liu said finally. "She would want you to know all of it, not just the painful parts, but the joy and love too. Perhaps you could come for tea next week? Properly invited this time?" Her gentle humor brought tearful smiles to both women's faces. David watched as something shifted in the room, like a window being opened to let in fresh air after years of stillness. He thought about his hidden camera, still recording in the corner. It had captured darkness, yes, but now it was witnessing something else, the beginning of healing, the slow, careful work of making amends. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood witnessed a subtle but significant transformation. Mrs. Anderson began her journey of redemption not with grand gestures, but with small, meaningful steps. Her first act was to enroll in counseling, facing the deep-seated anger and denial that had driven her to such desperate actions. She also started volunteering at the local senior center, where her nursing background could be put to use helping others instead of causing harm. David watched these changes unfold while remaining cautiously protective of his grandmother. He kept the camera in place, though now it captured very different scenes, Mrs. Anderson arriving at scheduled times, bringing not just cookies but old photos and documents she'd found in her mother's belongings. Each visit became a session of shared memories and healing. One particularly meaningful afternoon, Mrs. Anderson brought over a dusty photo album she'd discovered in her attic. "I found these last night," she said, handling the album with reverent care. "Pictures from when you and Mom first moved to the neighborhood." She opened it to reveal faded photographs of 2 young women, their faces bright with hope and friendship. Mrs. Liu's eyes lit up as she pointed to one photo. "Ah, this was your first birthday. Look how tiny you were. Your mother was so proud." The photograph showed a beaming young woman holding a baby, while a younger Mrs. Liu stood beside them, making funny faces to get the baby to smile. As they flipped through the pages, David noticed how the women in the photos gradually aged, their hairstyles and clothes changing with the decades. But what struck him most was how the joy in their expressions dimmed in the later photos, especially after the date when Mrs. Anderson's father's crimes were discovered. "I remember this day," Mrs. Liu said softly, pointing to a picture of a high school graduation. "Your mother worked 3 jobs to make sure you could go to the best school in the district. She was determined you would have every opportunity." Mrs. Anderson touched the photo gently. "I was so embarrassed that she couldn't afford to buy me a new dress for graduation. I wore this second-hand one, and I was horrible to her about it. Now I know that money was going to repay the families my father hurt." Her voice cracked with emotion. "All those sacrifices she made, and I never knew." David had been documenting everything, creating a digital archive of these stories and photographs. He'd started a private blog, recording the process of healing and reconciliation. With both women's permission, he planned to share their story someday, not as a tale of crime and punishment, but as a testimony to the power of truth and redemption. The community support fund that Mrs. Anderson had proposed was taking shape. She'd resigned from the city council as promised, but not before introducing the legislation to establish the fund. She dedicated her father's life insurance money, which she'd inherited after her mother's death, as the initial investment. The fund would provide educational scholarships and small business loans to immigrant families in the community. One evening, as David was reviewing the camera footage out of habit, he noticed something remarkable. His grandmother was laughing, really laughing, for the first time in months. She and Mrs. Anderson were looking at old recipes, trying to decipher the handwritten notes in the margins. The sound of their shared laughter, echoing through his speakers, brought unexpected tears to his eyes. The camera captured something else too, he told them later that evening. Both of you are healing. Not just from the recent past, but from decades of carried pain. He'd become more contemplative through this experience, more aware of how the past shaped the present. Mrs. Liu nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself. Your mother knew this, she said to Mrs. Anderson. It's why she worked so hard to repay those families. Not just for them, but for her own peace. Mrs. Anderson had started her own journey of repayment, though not with money. She'd begun recording her mother's story, including the difficult truths about her father, but also the story of redemption that followed. She planned to share it with other families struggling with hidden shame or generational trauma. I used to think protecting my father's reputation was the same as honoring his memory, she reflected, helping Mrs. Liu water her garden, an activity that had once been a source of fear but was now becoming a shared pleasure. But real honor comes from facing the truth and choosing to be better. David watched them from the kitchen window, struck by how natural their interaction had become. The fear and tension that had once filled these rooms had been replaced by something else, not quite friendship yet, but a shared commitment to healing old wounds and preventing new ones. He thought about the hidden camera that had started it all, still faithfully recording in its corner. What had begun as a tool to expose darkness had become a witness to light, capturing not just the truth about the past, but the daily, dedicated work of building a better future. As autumn painted the neighborhood in rich colors, the impact of Mrs. Liu and Mrs. Anderson's story began rippling through the community in unexpected ways. The local senior center, where Mrs. Anderson now volunteered regularly, had become a place where other families felt safe sharing their own hidden histories. It started when one elderly resident recognized her family's name in Mrs. Anderson's mother's notebook of repaid debts. My parents never told me where the money came from, the woman had said, tears in her eyes. They just said an angel had helped them keep their house during hard times. Now I know, it was your mother, trying to right your father's wrongs. This revelation led to others, as more families began connecting pieces of their past that had never quite made sense. David had been documenting these stories with his grandmother's blessing, carefully anonymizing the details while preserving the essential truths. His blog, initially started as a private record, had evolved into a community archive of healing and reconciliation. Each new entry showed how one act of truth-telling could inspire others to face their own family secrets. One crisp morning, Mrs. Liu received an unexpected package. Inside was a collection of letters from families who had been affected by the bank scandal decades ago. They weren't angry letters demanding justice, instead, they were messages of gratitude for finally understanding their family histories, for having context for their parents' struggles and triumphs. Listen to this one, Mrs. Liu said, her voice thick with emotion as she read aloud. My father worked 3 jobs after losing our savings, never complaining, never giving up. I used to think he was just stubborn. Now I know he was teaching us about dignity in the face of injustice. Thank you for helping us understand his strength. Mrs. Anderson had been visiting when the package arrived, and David watched through the camera as she listened to the letters being read, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The shame that had once driven her to violence had transformed into a quiet determination to honor these stories. The community support fund was flourishing beyond their expectations. What had started as a way to make amends had grown into a vital resource for local families. Mrs. Anderson worked tirelessly behind the scenes, no longer as a city council member but as someone committed to genuine service. She helped families navigate loan applications, offered guidance on educational opportunities, and shared her mother's story as a testament to the possibility of redemption. One day, while helping Mrs. Liu tend her garden, now a shared passion that had replaced their painful past, Mrs. Anderson made a surprising suggestion. "What if we started a memory project?" she proposed, carefully pruning a rose bush. "Not just about what happened at the bank, but about all the immigrant families who built this community. Their struggles, their triumphs, their everyday acts of courage." Mrs. Liu paused in her weeding, considering the idea. "Like a living history?" she asked. "Something to help the younger generations understand their roots?" David, who had been watching through the kitchen window, came outside to join them. "We could use the blog platform," he suggested. "Create a space where families can share their stories, connect with others who went through similar experiences." The idea took root as naturally as the flowers in Mrs. Liu's garden. Families began coming forward, sharing photographs, letters, and memories. Young people interviewed their grandparents, often discovering family histories they'd never known. The project revealed how interconnected their community had been, even in times of hardship. Mrs. Anderson discovered that her role in the project helped her process her own grief and shame. "Each story we collect," she explained to David one evening, "helps me understand my mother better." Her determination to make things right wasn't just about money, it was about preserving the dignity of every family affected. The hidden camera that had once captured scenes of fear and intimidation now recorded weekly gatherings where multiple generations came together to share their stories. David had considered removing it many times, but both his grandmother and Mrs. Anderson had asked him to keep it running. "Let it record the healing too," Mrs. Liu had said. "The full story matters." As winter approached, the Senior Center organized a community dinner to celebrate the Memory Project's success. The walls were lined with photographs and stories from different families, spanning decades of community history. Mrs. Liu's garden had provided flowers for every table, and Mrs. Anderson had helped prepare traditional dishes from various cultures represented in their neighborhood. During the dinner, an elderly man stood up to speak. He was one of the original account holders from the bank scandal, and his voice trembled as he addressed the room. 40 years ago, we lost our savings in this community. But today, we've gained something more valuable, our shared truth. Our children and grandchildren will know not just the story of what was taken from us, but the story of how we rebuilt, how we supported each other, how we turned loss into legacy." David watched as his grandmother and Mrs. Anderson sat together at the main table, no longer divided by secrets and shame. The camera in his pocket, a smaller version of the original, captured the moment they shared, a knowing look, a look that spoke of hard-won peace and the profound power of facing the truth, no matter how difficult. 1 year after David had first installed the hidden camera, he sat in his living room reviewing the footage one last time. The scenes playing across his screen told a story of transformation that even he had trouble believing sometimes. His grandmother sat beside him, her gentle presence a reminder of how far they'd come from those frightening days of mysterious falls and unspoken fears. "I think it's time," she said softly, glancing at the corner where the camera had faithfully recorded their journey. "We don't need it anymore." Mrs. Anderson, who now visited every Sunday afternoon for tea and gardening, nodded in agreement. "The only watching we need now is over those new rose bushes we planted," she said, her attempt at humor carrying the weight of understanding how much trust had been rebuilt. The Community Support Fund had exceeded all expectations, helping 15 families start small businesses and sending 7 students to college in its first year alone. But beyond the tangible achievements, it was the intangible changes that moved David the most. The weekly storytelling sessions at the Senior Center had become a beloved community tradition, with younger generations eagerly learning about their heritage and older residents finding peace in sharing their long-held secrets. "Remember when we first found those letters?" David asked, pausing the footage on a frame from that pivotal afternoon. The image showed three people caught in a moment of painful revelation: his grandmother holding the wooden box, Mrs. Anderson confronting decades of family secrets, and himself standing protective watch over them both. Mrs. Liu reached for the wooden box, now kept openly on the living room shelf rather than hidden away. These letters started as a burden, she reflected, but they became a bridge. Not just between past and present, but between people who thought they could never understand each other. The Memory Project had grown into a digital archive, with hundreds of stories from community members. Each entry was a thread in a larger tapestry of immigrant experiences, family struggles, and triumphant resilience. Mrs. Anderson had recently completed her own contribution, a detailed account of her mother's journey from discovering her husband's crimes to spending her life making anonymous restitution. "Mom would be proud of how this turned out," Mrs. Anderson said, her voice steady with hard-won acceptance. "Not just the fund or the stories, but how we chose to handle the truth when it finally came to light." David stood up and walked to the camera, ready to remove it from its hiding place. As he reached for it, his grandmother's voice stopped him. "Wait," she said. "Let's make one last recording." The three of them gathered on the couch, facing the camera that had started their journey. Mrs. Liu spoke first, her voice clear and strong. "To anyone who might see this someday, our story began with fear and secrets, but it didn't end there. Sometimes the hardest truths lead to the most beautiful transformations." Mrs. Anderson took a deep breath before adding her own thoughts. "I came looking for letters to destroy evidence of the past. Instead, I found a way to honor it by helping build a better future. My father's actions hurt this community, but my mother's courage and Mrs. Liu's forgiveness showed me that redemption is always possible." David watched them through the camera's lens one last time, struck by how natural they looked together now, his grandmother's serene wisdom, Mrs. Anderson's hard-won peace. The fear that had once filled this room had been replaced by something profound, the quiet strength of people who had faced their deepest truths and chosen to grow from them. The following weekend, they held a small ceremony in Mrs. Liu's garden. The rose bushes they'd planted together were beginning to bloom, their fragrance filling the air. Community members gathered to celebrate not just the success of the Support Fund and Memory Project, but the deeper healing it represented. As David finally removed the camera from its corner, he realized its purpose had evolved far beyond catching a wrongdoer. It had become a witness to healing, a keeper of truths that needed to be faced, and ultimately, a tool for transformation. The footage would be preserved in the community archive, not as evidence of crimes, but as testimony to the power of confronting the past with courage and compassion. That evening, as the sun set over their peaceful suburban street, David watched his grandmother and Mrs. Anderson sharing tea and mooncakes in the garden. Their laughter floated through the open window, no longer the forced politeness of neighbors hiding secrets, but the genuine warmth of people who had walked through darkness together and found light on the other side. Mrs. Liu's voice carried from the garden, sharing another story about Mrs. Anderson's mother, this one filled with joy rather than sorrow. The past hadn't been erased or forgotten, but it had been transformed into something that could nurture rather than wound. The mysterious falls that had once brought fear had led to a different kind of falling, the falling away of secrets, of shame, of old barriers between neighbors. As David joined them in the garden, he thought about how a simple hidden camera had revealed not just the truth they were looking for, but deeper truths about forgiveness, redemption, and the healing power of facing the past together. The camera was gone now, but its most important legacy lived on in the strengthened bonds between neighbors, the stories being passed down to new generations, and the quiet triumph of people who had chosen truth over comfort, healing over hatred, and love over fear.